Have you ever gone on a mission trip and cleaned toilets? Well, this is something that has actually happened to me, and it has changed my life. I will never forget about the time that I went to Kentucky with my family on a family mission trip, and one of my sole responsibilities was to clean the toilet. This is one of those experiences that you can't make up, that it actually happened, but it has changed my life in a very deep and meaningful way. I want to talk to you today about spiritual formation and how you can integrate and develop that in your life through service and ministry. My name is Shelly Chandler, and I'm so happy to be here with you today. And we're going to see how we can make sense of toilet cleaning and service and ministry and how all those things wrap together. But for us, since we are Christians, the first thing we want to go to, the first thing we want to look at, of course, for us, is Jesus. He will always be our example of what it looks like to live out this Christian life. And Jesus is the one who shows us how to do service and ministry at home and in the community. So the first thing I think of when I think of Jesus and I think of him doing acts of service, one of the very first things I think of, and I bet you're thinking of it too, is the day that he washed the disciples' feet. Now that's not an everyday occurrence. That was not something that was normal for them to do. And we can read about it in the book of John, chapter 13. And I'm going to talk about just a short retelling of what that night actually looked like. So the disciples are all sitting around the table with Jesus, and they're having dinner, just like we would have dinner at any night. And they're relaxed, they're reclined, and they're all waiting to be served. They're all waiting for the food to happen. And all of a sudden, Jesus gets up. He removes his outer cloak, he wraps a towel around his waist, and then he goes around, kneels in front of the disciples, removes their sandals, and begins to wash their feet. The disciples, of course, are just taken aback. They don't know what to think about this. This is their master. This is their leader who has assumed this position of humility. And they're wondering, what is Jesus up to? And what is Jesus's purpose? And that's what we want to know as well. We want to know, what is the purpose behind this image that Jesus portrayed that night as a servant? Well, first of all, we know a couple of things. Jesus knew two very important things. He knew that his time had come. The Gospel of John tells us in chapter 13 that Jesus knew that his time had come and that he soon would be returning back to the Father. He also knew that God had given him victory in all things. He had told him specifically that all things are in the hand of Jesus and that Jesus would have victory in all things. But he also knew one very important fact about that night. He knew that those at the table that he was washing their feet would either abandon him or ultimately betray him. And he did it anyway. So just picture this in your mind. Picture Jesus going around as he's removed his cloak, he's wrapped the towel around his waist, and he's kneeling down and he is washing their feet. Just picture that in your mind, what that looks like. And then think of Jesus as he rises, as he wraps his cloak back around him, as he removes the dirty towel, and then he sits back down and he says to his disciples this very poignant question. He asks them, "Do you understand what I have done?" I love this question. I love that Jesus asked these types of questions because we need to think about these kinds of things. We need to think and ask these types of questions. Do you understand what I have done? We need to also see that Jesus did something that is just so out of the ordinary when he washed their feet. Where was he at before? Well, he was sitting, reclining at the table. He was actually in a position of comfort. So we have a sectional at our house that has seen better days. All three of my teenage sons and the dog have lived on this couch now. I think it's about 12 years old, and it is the definition of broken in. It may just be broken. I'm not sure by now, but this couch is very well loved. And in our house, we have an unspoken rule. It's not one that's written down, but everyone knows that this is the case, that if you're sitting on the couch and if someone is in the kitchen, you have freedom to say, hey, would you bring me a drink? Would you bring me a snack? Because whoever's on the couch does not want to remove themselves from their position of comfort. I'm sure you have something very similar at your house as well. So it's very interesting that Jesus was willing, as a leader of the disciples, to remove himself from his position of comfort and assume a position of humility. And so we have to ask ourselves, what does this mean for us as leaders, as teachers, as ministers, as people who are striving to develop our churches in a way that mirror and reflect who Christ is? What does this mean for us? And so we have to look at those two very important things. We have to look at Jesus' position, and we have to look at his place. And we have to also focus and think about that question. Do you understand what I have done? So first of all, Jesus' place that he has here, he is the leader of this group. He is the one who is the father figure, who is the rabbi, who is the teacher, who is the Son of God that they have already recognized and declared. And yet he is willing to abase himself in this way. And so we have to ask, what is Jesus' plan here? What is his agenda? What is he trying to show the disciples? And we know if we continue to read the story that he tells them in John chapter 13 that no master is greater than those he is serving. No master is greater than those that he is teaching. No master is greater than his disciples. And he looks at all of them, and I can just imagine it in my mind as he turns and all of them with their freshly cleaned feet, as he looks at them and says, now I want you to go and do likewise. Philippians chapter 2 is such a beautiful set of verses that explains something to us about what Jesus was getting at. Remember how he removed himself from that position of comfort to a position of humility. Well, that is the typical for Jesus. That is the norm. And Philippians 2 explains a little bit more about this to us when it says that while Jesus was God, he did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but rather he made himself nothing, and he took on the very nature of a servant. Jesus continues in his leadership to show humility. And he goes on to tell the disciples that if you want to be great in my kingdom, you'll be the least of these. Now, we have a man at our church that I admire so much. And it's not one of the leaders, and it's not one of the pastors, although they are very much worthy of my admiration. Instead, it's our building supervisor. And he always has a smile on his face, and he always is very joyful. And he is the one that vacuums and sweeps and mops, and he is the one that cleans the toilets. And he does it with such grace, and he does it with such humility, and he does it with such honor. It brings him great joy to serve the church this way. This is what Jesus was trying to get across to his disciples. If you want to be great, you got to serve. And this is what it means for us as leaders today. Sometimes we have to get out of our comfort zone. Sometimes we have been given all things. We have been given that position of leadership. We have great responsibility that comes with that. But Jesus is our example to show us that even though we have been given this great responsibility and we are put in this position of leadership and in this position of power, if we really truly want to be great, the way for us to do that is to become humble and to serve. Philippians 2 also tells us at the very beginning of that chapter that each of us should look not only to our own interest, but also to the interest of others. And then it says a really great verse when it says, and your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus. And then it continues with the verses that I already spoke of when it says, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, and he took on the nature of a servant. This is who Jesus is, and this is who he was for us. And this is our example that we are to follow. So great. What do we do with all that information? Now that we know what Jesus did, we have this wonderful example of him washing the feet. But I promise you, I'm not going to go around washing people's feet at my church, and I bet you're not either. So what does that mean for us today? How do we go about showing this kind of humility in our everyday lives? Well, one good thing for us that we can do is here's just a few practical tips that you can do to show service for yourself and for those in your church. We at our church specifically have different nonprofit groups that we have adopted. And every year we go around doing whatever we can do to help them. But one particular thing we do is at Christmas every year, we have something at our church called the Giving Trees. And we contact the local nonprofits and we say, hey, what do you need this year? What is a great way that we can just bless you this Christmas season? What are some practical needs that you have? And they give us a list and we type up the list. We put little tags on the trees, and then the people in our church, they go around each year and they pick a tag off the tree. They fill what's on the list and then they bring it back to the church, and then the church takes their time and distributes it throughout the Christmas season. It's a beautiful example of what it looks like to have community and to show service and ministry in your community. But what about at home? Well, if you think about what I told you about our couch and how we demonstrate service to one another, I know that's very silly, but it's also a very practical way to show that. At home, it's the same way. When you look at those that you're surrounded with, those that we really should be loving the greatest, those are the ones that we need to show that to demonstrate that kind of humility, that kind of love, and that we are looking to their best interests first before we seek our own, and that we are emulating Christ as he did move himself from that position of comfort to that position of humility. It's actually the same in any area that you look at. When we are to implement and develop and integrate service and ministry into our spiritual formation, into our spiritual journey, it usually begins with moving from a position of comfort to a position of humility. And it's in that humbleness that we can turn and serve. And it's in that humbleness that we really display Christ for who he is. So I want to ask that question one more time that Christ asked. Do you understand what I have done? It's a very simple question, but it's also very profound. We as Christians, we as followers of Jesus, can live lives of service and lives of ministry when we understand what Christ has done, when we recognize the humility that he has displayed in his life for us, how he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on the cross for us. When we grasp what Christ has done, then we can look at the Lord when he says, go and do the same. We can say, yes.